Rain smeared the reinforced glass of the 24th floor conference room, turning the downtown skyline into a grey, weeping blur. Inside, the climate control hummed a sterile, indifferent tune. Dean sat at the far edge of the long mahogany table, his thrift store suit damp at the shoulders. From the walk from the subway smelled faintly of mothballs and wet dog. He kept his hands in his lap, acutely aware of the frayed cuffs of his shirt. Across from him, Aunt Patricia adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the overhead recessed lighting. She smelled of a chemical jasmine perfume so strong it made the back of Dean's throat itch. Next to her slouched Wyatt. His cousin was scrolling through something on a matte black phone, entirely disinterested in the proceedings, wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than Dean made in 6 months. Henderson, the estate lawyer, cleared his throat. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. He adjusted his half-moon glasses and looked down at the thick stack of cream-coloured paper resting perfectly centred on his leather blotter. We come now to the final dispensations of the late Mr. Charles Whitmore's estate. Henderson droned his voice devoid of any inflection. Dean swallowed hard. His mouth was dry. A dull ache throbbed behind his left eye, a stress headache that had been building since he got the phone call about his grandfather's passing. He didn't expect much. Charles had made his disdain for Dean's father, and by extension, Dean abundantly clear over the last 3 decades. But desperation does strange things to a man's expectations. Dean was 3 weeks behind on rent. His car's transmission was a localized tragedy waiting to happen. A few $1,000s. That was all he prayed for, just enough to breathe. To my daughter Patricia. Henderson read, I leave the estate in Aspen alongside the remaining shares in the Whitmore Holding Company. To my grandson Wyatt, I leave the liquid assets held in the offshore trust to be managed at his discretion. Wyatt didn't even look up from his phone. He just gave a slight arrogant twitch of his lips. Patricia sniffed, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye with a monogrammed handkerchief. Dean stared at the grain of the mahogany table. He traced the dark, swirling patterns with his eyes. Just give me the crumbs, he thought, the internal plea tasting like ash. I'll take the crumbs. Henderson turned a page. The crisp snap of the heavy paper echoed in the quiet room. The lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second. His eyes flicked up, meeting Dean's over the rims of his glasses. It was a look of profound, agonizing pity. Dean's stomach plummeted. Pity from a corporate lawyer was a death sentence. And finally, Henderson continued, his voice dropping a half octave. To my grandson Dean, who has never understood the value of $1 nor the weight of a hard day's labour, who chose the dirt path over the paved road at every opportunity. Patricia let out a soft, breathy sound of agreement. Wyatt finally looked up, a cruel, expectant smirk stretching across his face. Dean felt the blood rush to his cheeks, hot and prickly. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to flip the heavy wooden table, to scream that he had worked 60-hour weeks in kitchens and warehouses, while they sat in air-conditioned boardrooms. But his body betrayed him. His shoulders hunched. He shrunk into the expensive leather chair, suddenly feeling very small, very tired, and entirely defeated. He didn't look angry. He looked nauseous. To Dean. Henderson read, pushing the words out as if they were a chore. I leave the structure known as the Miller Creek Barn and the immediate quarter-acre of unarable land it occupies in the lower valley. Perhaps there among the rot and the vermin he will feel at home. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Then Wyatt laughed. It wasn't a booming laugh, just a short, sharp snort of absolute amusement. A barn, Wyatt chuckled, tossing his phone onto the table. He left the pauper a literal shack. You can finally start that farm you never shut up about when we were kids, Dean. Oh wait, the land is unarable. Wyatt, please, Patricia chided, though a faint, cruel smile played at the corners of her painted mouth. Have some respect for the dead, and for Dean's new estate. Henderson reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy rusted iron key attached to a piece of frayed twine. He slid it across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop, inches from Dean's pale, trembling hands. The rust left a faint, reddish-brown smear on the pristine wood. Dean stared at the key. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He felt a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. He didn't deliver a witty comeback. He didn't storm out in a blaze of righteous fury. He just sat there swallowing bile. Slowly his hand reached out. His knuckles were white. His fingers, calloused and scarred from years of manual labor, closed around the cold, jagged iron. The metal dug into his palm. "Thank you," Dean whispered. His voice cracked. It was pathetic. He knew it. They knew it. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the thick carpet. Without making eye contact with anyone in the room, Dean turned and walked toward the frosted glass doors. He felt their eyes boring into his cheap, ill-fitting suit. He heard Wyatt's muffled snickering resume as the door clicked shut behind him. Out in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed violently. Dean leaned against the cold wall, gasping for air. He looked at the rusted key in his hand. A barn. A rotting, empty barn. That was his legacy. That was all he was worth. The drive to Miller Creek took 3 hours, mostly because Dean's 2004 sedan refused to exceed 50 miles an hour without shaking violently. The heater had died 3 winters ago. Cold, damp air blasted through the vents, carrying the distinct, depressing smells of wet upholstery, stale coffee, and burning oil. He gripped the cracked steering wheel until his hands ached. The windshield wipers squeaked in a rhythm that felt like mocking laughter. Pauper. Rot. Vermin. The words from the will cycled through his mind, a toxic loop he couldn't shut off. He should have tossed the key into a storm drain. He should have cut his losses and picked up an extra shift at the loading dock. But a morbid, self-flagellating curiosity had driven him onto the highway, steering him toward the forgotten edges of the county. The paved road gave way to cracked asphalt, which eventually surrendered to deep, muddy ruts. Naked trees with skeletal branches scraped against the car's side panels, a screeching sound that set Dean's teeth on edge. He hit the brakes. The car slid through the muck before coming to a jarring halt. There it was. Dean killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavy and oppressive. He pushed the car door open, wincing as the hinges screamed in protest. His boots sank an inch into the cold grey mud with a sickening squelch. The Miller Creek barn leaned dramatically to the left, looking as though a strong gust of wind would finally put it out of its misery. The wood was black with age, and rot curled at the edges like dead leaves. The roof sagged in the middle, missing most of its shingles, exposing the ribs of the rafters to the weeping grey sky. It smelled of deep, undisturbed decay, wet earth, oxidized iron, and generations of rat droppings. "Home, sweet home," Dean muttered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The sarcasm felt hollow. He waded through waist-high weeds that clung to his damp trousers like wet fingers. He approached the massive sliding wooden doors. A heavy steel padlock fused shut by decades of rust held the handles together. Dean pulled the key from his pocket. The twine snapped immediately. He jammed the jagged iron into the lock. It wouldn't turn. He jiggled it, cursed, and forced it with all his weight. A sharp flake of rust broke off, slicing deep into the pad of his thumb. "Damn it!" Dean hissed, yanking his hand back. Dark red blood welled up, mixing with the orange rust on his skin. He sucked on the cut, the metallic taste flooding his mouth. The pain was sharp, sudden, and it broke something inside him. The dam holding back his humiliation burst. He kicked the heavy wooden door with the heel of his boot. Once, twice. The wood splintered, but the lock held. He picked up a football-sized rock from the mud, his breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. He brought it down on the padlock with a primal grunt. Metal shrieked. He hit it again, and again. On the 5th strike, the rusted shackle snapped. Dean dropped the rock. His chest heaved. He grabbed the heavy iron handles and pulled. The doors shrieked on rusted tracks, dragging a trench through the mud as they parted. He stepped inside. The air was dense, thick with particulate matter that caught in his throat. Faint shafts of gloomy light bled through the holes in the roof, illuminating floating dust motes and the skeletal remains of old farm equipment. A rusted tractor sat in the corner, consumed by a mountain of rotting hay. There was nothing here. No hidden classic cars, no antique furniture, just dirt, dampness and failure. Dean walked down the center aisle. His boots echoed dully against the packed earth and patches of rotted wooden planking. The cold seeped through the soles of his shoes, gnawing at his bones. He reached the back wall and sank down onto an overturned, splintered apple crate. He buried his face in his hands. He didn't cry. He was too tired to cry. He just felt an overwhelming, crushing emptiness. Wyatt was right. It was a joke. A final, posthumous middle finger from a man who despised him. He sat there for 20 minutes, listening to the drip, drip, drip of rainwater leaking through the roof and hitting the dirt. The cold was becoming unbearable. He needed to leave. He needed to get back to his miserable apartment and figure out how to avoid his landlord. Dean pushed himself off the crate. As he shifted his weight, the heel of his right boot came down hard on a section of wooden flooring near the back stall. Thud. He froze. He tapped his left foot on the dirt. A dull, flat sound. He tapped his right boot on the wood again. Thwack. It wasn't just wood. It was hollow. Deeply hollow. Dean frowned. His cynical brain immediately supplied an answer. Greater sinkhole. You're going to fall into a septic tank and drown in century-old manure, but he knelt down anyway. He brushed away a thick layer of damp dirt and petrified hay. Underneath the floorboards were unusually wide, cut from thick oak. Unlike the rest of the barn, these boards didn't look completely rotted. They were tightly fitted, secured not with iron nails but with heavy wooden pegs. Dean pulled his keys from his pocket, flipped open a small pocket knife, and jammed the blade into the gap between two boards. He pried. The blade snapped with a sharp ping, hitting him in the cheek. Son of a... He rubbed his face, infuriated. He looked around wildly. He grabbed a rusted iron crowbar leaning against a stool. He wedged the crowbar into the seam. He threw his entire body weight into it. The wood groaned a deep, protesting sound. The damp air smelled suddenly of dry, ancient sawdust. With a violent crack, the wooden pegs sheared off. The heavy oak board popped up. Dean tossed the crowbar aside and grabbed the edge of the board with his bare hands, ignoring the splinters driving into his palms. He heaved it out of the way. He pried up a second board, then a third. He sat back, his breath catching in his throat. Beneath the floor wasn't dirt. It wasn't a sinkhole. Set into the earth, perfectly preserved within a concrete-lined depression, was a heavy oiled canvas tarp. It was secured tightly with thick leather straps. And right in the center of the canvas, attached to something solid beneath it, rested a massive gleaming handle ring, forged from solid brass. It didn't have a speck of rust on it. It looked as though it had been polished yesterday. Dean's hands trembled. The blood from his cut thumb dripped onto the dry canvas, a single dark stain in the oppressive gloom. He reached out his fingers, brushing the cold, smooth brass. The silence of the barn suddenly felt very different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Dean stared at the brass ring. It sat there, an anomaly of pristine metal surrounded by decades of rot, mocking his hesitation. His cut thumb throbbed a steady, localized pulse that kept him grounded in the frigid reality of the barn. He wiped a mixture of blood and rust on the thigh of his cheap trousers, took a slow, ragged breath, and knelt beside the canvas. Thick leather straps secured the edges of the tarp to bolts driven deep into the concrete foundation. The leather was petrified, stiff as dried bone. Dean dug his fingers under the first buckle. He had to use both hands, straining until his shoulders ached to force the heavy brass tongue out of the hardened leather notch. It gave way with a sharp crack that echoed loudly in the cavernous space above him. He moved to the next one. There were 4 in total. By the time he undid the last strap, his fingertips were raw and aching. He gripped the brass ring. The metal was startlingly cold. He braced his boots against the lip of the concrete depression, gritted his teeth and pulled. It didn't budge. It felt like he was trying to deadlift the entire foundation of the barn. "Come on," Dean whispered, his voice hoarse. He adjusted his grip, wrapped his bloody thumb tightly around the curved brass, and threw his entire body weight backward. Something beneath the canvas groaned. A deep scraping sound of heavy timber rubbing against concrete vibrated through the floorboards. Slowly, agonizingly, the hatch lifted. A rush of displaced air hit Dean's face. He gagged, turning his head away. He expected the overwhelming stench of raw sewage or a mass grave of dead raccoons. Instead, the air was intensely dry. It smelled of ozone, old paper, and a faint metallic tang like gun oil and hot dust. He pulled the hatch back until it hit the floorboards with a heavy, satisfying thud. The canvas fell away, revealing a perfectly square opening cut into the earth. It was pitch black inside. Dean pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked, spiderwebbed across the battery icon, which read a dismal 34%. He tapped the flashlight icon. The small LED cut a harsh, narrow beam through the darkness. A ladder made of welded rebar descended straight down. The concrete walls of the shaft were completely dry, free of the moss and moisture that plagued the barn above. His sensible brain screamed at him to leave. This was a confined space. It could be filled with carbon monoxide or black mold. But the eviction notice folded in his wallet was a much more immediate threat. Dean swung his legs over the edge, gripped the top rung of the rebar ladder, and began to climb down. The descent was longer than he anticipated. 12, 13, 14 rungs. His boots finally hit a solid surface. The sound was flat and hard. Poured concrete. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs, and swept the phone's flashlight across the space. It wasn't a root cellar. It was a room. Roughly 20 by 20 feet, the ceiling surprisingly high, supported by thick steel I-beams. The walls were cinder block, painted a sterile institutional grey. On the wall immediately to his left, the flashlight beam caught a large industrial electrical panel. Dean walked over to it. His boots scuffed against the dusty floor, the sound unnervingly loud. He opened the grey metal door of the panel. Inside sat a heavy-duty throw switch, the kind used in old factories. He grabbed the handle and shoved it upward. A heavy clank echoed through the room. For a terrifying 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then a low guttural hum vibrated through the concrete under his feet. A generator somewhere behind the walls was waking up. A moment later, the overhead lights' long-caged fluorescent tubes began to stutter. They snapped and popped, casting erratic strobe-like flashes across the room, before finally settling into a steady, sickly, greenish-white glare. Dean clicked off his phone flashlight and slipped it back into his pocket. He blinked, letting his eyes adjust to the harsh light. The room was meticulously organized. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, rotting barn above. Against the far wall sat 3 massive fireproof filing cabinets secured with heavy combination locks. In the center of the room rested a sprawling vintage tanker desk made of heavy-gauge steel, its surface completely clear, save for a green glass banker's lamp. To the right, a long wooden workbench was covered in tools, not farm equipment, but precision instruments. Magnifying glasses, a soldering iron digital calipers, and neat rows of small glass jars filled with screws and electronic components. Dean walked slowly toward the center of the room, running his fingers along the edge of the workbench. There was a thin layer of fine grey dust coating everything, indicating the room hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. He turned his attention to the desk. It looked like an interrogator's table. Heavy, imposing, built to last a century. He pulled the heavy wooden chair out. The casters shrieked against the concrete floor. Sitting down, Dean felt a strange, chilling disconnect. Upstairs, Charles Whitmore was known as a ruthless real estate magnate, a man who lived in glass penthouses and flew in private jets. Down here in this windowless concrete bunker was the ghost of a deeply paranoid, meticulous man. Dean reached for the top right drawer of the desk. He expected it to be locked. He pulled the metal handle. The drawer slid open silently on oiled tracks. Inside, there was no money, no gold bars, no velvet bags of family jewels. There was only a single heavy ring of keys and a thick black leather-bound ledger. Dust motes danced in the harsh fluorescent light swirling around Dean's head as he stared at the open drawer. He didn't touch anything, not right away. He just sat there listening to the low, rhythmic thrum of the hidden generator behind the concrete wall. His breathing sounded loud and ragged in the heavy silence. He finally reached into the drawer. He bypassed the heavy ring of keys and grabbed the ledger. It was substantial, weighing maybe 5 pounds, bound in cracked, unbranded black leather. The pages were edged in faded gold foil, though the corners were deeply worn from years of handling. Dean dropped the heavy book onto the center of the steel desk. It hit with a dull thud, sending up a tiny cloud of grey dust. He opened the front cover. The spine cracked loudly in protest. The first page was blank, save for a single date written in the top right corner in sharp, aggressive cursive, October 14th, 1992. He turned the page. Columns of numbers and dense, cramped handwriting filled the paper. It was unmistakably his grandfather's script, slanted violently to the right, the T's crossed with angry slashed lines. Dean squinted, trying to make sense of the accounting. It wasn't corporate revenue. It wasn't the Whitmore Holding Company's stock portfolios or real estate acquisitions. Dean ran his cut, dirt-stained finger down the left-hand margin. Names. Just names, dates, and short-clipped descriptions. August 4th, 1998. Patricia. Aspen property remodel. Invoice falsified. $140,000 funneled to offshore account Cayman. Handled local contractor complaints with $20,000 hush payout. Dean stopped breathing. He read it again. He flipped forward a dozen pages, the stiff paper rustling loudly in the quiet bunker. November 12th, 2005. Wyatt. Hit and run, Boulder city limits. No fatalities. Local PD chief compensated $250,000 from discretionary fund. Vehicle crushed at Miller scrap. Frame narrative stolen vehicle. Dean's stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. He felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over him. He pushed the chair back, standing up so fast the heavy casters squealed against the concrete. Jesus Christ, he muttered, running a trembling hand through his damp hair. He paced the length of the desk, looking from the ledger to the locked filing cabinets against the wall. The ledgers weren't accounting for wealth. They were accounting for sins. Every bribe, every embezzlement, every illegal cover-up his aunt and cousin had ever committed, meticulously documented, costed and archived by the patriarch who supposedly adored them. Charles Whitmore hadn't been a fool blind to his family's rot. He had been its silent underwriter. He had let them steal, let them break the law, let them act like untouchable royalty, all while keeping the receipts. Dean walked back to the desk and flipped toward the back of the book, checking the more recent entries. The handwriting grew slightly shakier, betraying Charles's failing health over the last few years. But the meticulous nature of the records never wavered. June 2nd, 2023. Patricia attempting to leverage holding company shares for personal debt. Blocked via proxy. She thinks I don't see the margins. Tucked into the very last page of the ledger was a standard white envelope. It was sealed completely blank except for one word written across the center in black ink. Dean. His hands were shaking violently now. He picked up the envelope. The paper felt thick, expensive. He slid his thumb under the flap and tore it open. A single sheet of heavy stationery rested inside. He unfolded it. Dean, the letter began. If you are reading this, you actually went to the barn. I bet Henderson half expected you to throw the key in his face. You always did have more pride than sense. You are a failure by every metric I have ever respected. You have no ambition, no killer instinct, and no understanding of how power operates in this world. You chose to work with your hands for pennies, while your cousins learned to manipulate millions. I spent my life building an empire, and you spent yours running from it. Dean's jaw tightened. Even from the grave, the old man couldn't resist twisting the knife. But the letter continued. You are the only person in this bloodline who isn't a thief, a parasite, or a liability. Patricia is a vulture waiting for a carcass. Wyatt is an arrogant liability who will end up in a federal penitentiary before he hits 40. I did not build this family's legacy to have it squandered by entitled children who mistake my patience for ignorance. I protected them because they shared my name. I am dead now. My obligations are concluded. The keys in the drawer correspond to the filing cabinets. The cabinets contain the physical proof, the bank statements, the crushed car VINs, the wire transfer receipts, the signed confessions from the people I paid to look the other way. It is a loaded gun aimed directly at the heads of Patricia and Wyatt. The offshore trust Wyatt thinks he inherited is frozen tied to a shell company in Panama. The deeds to the Aspen estate are contested by 3 separate holding companies, all controlled from this room. They inherited the illusion of my wealth. You inherited the reality of it. What you do with this is your choice. Burn it and go back to your miserable apartment. Or use it, break them, and take what is actually yours. Dean stared at the paper. The words blurred together. His grandfather hadn't left him a barn. He had left him the detonator to the entire Whitmore empire. A sharp grinding noise from above shattered the silence. Dean's head snapped up. Dust drifted down from the ceiling boards. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy crunch of tires rolling slowly over the thick gravel and mud outside the barn doors. Someone had followed him, or someone else knew about the bunker. An engine idled, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the concrete walls. Then the distinct heavy thud of a car door slamming shut. Gravel crunched violently under the weight of heavy tires, the sound echoing through the rotting planks of the barn. Outside, an engine gave a low, throaty rumble before abruptly cutting off. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the rhythmic pinging of hot metal cooling in the damp air and the steady, betraying hum of the generator echoing from the bunker below. Dean stood frozen beside the steel desk. The letter slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering onto the open pages of the black ledger. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Flight instinct screamed at him to hide, but a quick glance around the stark, brightly lit concrete room offered no refuge. There were no shadows here, only harsh fluorescent angles, and the undeniable reality of his presence. Footsteps approached the barn doors. They weren't the cautious, measured steps of a stranger. They were heavy, entitled, and fast. The mud outside sloshed and sucked at the soles of whoever was walking, a wet, heavy sound that made the hairs on the back of Dean's neck stand up. "Dean!" a voice called out. It echoed sharply in the cavernous space above. Wyatt. Dean's stomach plummeted. He recognized the sharp, impatient cadence immediately. Wyatt never called his name. He barked it, treating it like a command rather than a greeting. "I see your piece of trash car out here," Wyatt yelled, his voice muffled slightly by the floorboards. "What the hell are you doing? I know you're in there." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Dean's veins. He looked down at the desk. The keys, the ledger, the letter. This wasn't a game. This was decades of felonies meticulously catalogued in a black leather binding. If Wyatt saw it, if he understood what was down here, Dean wouldn't just be humiliated. He would be in actual physical danger. Wyatt had already bought his way out of a hit and run. Crushing a broke cousin in a deserted barn wouldn't even warrant a separate ledger entry. Dean's hands moved clumsily, his fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold and adrenaline. He snatched the letter and shoved it into the front pocket of his trousers. The heavy iron keyring went into the other pocket, clanking loudly against his thigh. He grabbed the ledger. It felt impossibly heavy, a dense brick of paper and ruin. He unzipped his cheap winter coat, shoved the book against his ribs, and zipped the jacket back up. It formed a rigid, awkward block against his side, digging painfully into his ribs. Dean. The sound of Wyatt's heavy boots hitting the wooden floorboards above made dust rain down through the open hatch. "Are you deaf?" Dean rushed to the rebar ladder, his boots scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He grabbed the cold iron rungs. His cut thumb, which had just begun to clot, split open again. Warm blood slicked the metal, but he didn't stop. He hauled himself up, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Every movement felt agonizingly loud. He was a clumsy, desperate man, dragging himself out of a hole totally devoid of grace or composure. He reached the top, his head breaching the level of the barn floor. Wyatt stood 10 feet away, staring down at him. The contrast was jarring. Wyatt wore a tailored camel hair overcoat over a cashmere turtleneck. The fabric was immaculate, perfectly draped, though the hems of his expensive Italian leather trousers were spattered with the grey mud of Miller Creek. He held a sleek, high-powered aluminum flashlight, its beam cutting sharply through the gloom, illuminating the swirling dust motes between them. "What in the world?" Wyatt muttered, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second as he took in the heavy canvas, the brass ring, and the illuminated square hole in the floor. Dean pulled himself over the concrete lip. His boot caught on the edge, and he fell forward, hitting his knee hard against the unforgiving floorboards. A sharp bolt of pain shot up his thigh. He scrambled to his feet, wincing, feeling his face flush with immediate hot humiliation. He looked like a rat scurrying out of a drain. "What are you doing here, Wyatt?" Dean asked. His voice betrayed him. He wanted it to sound firm, demanding. Instead, it came out breathless and shaky. Wyatt's eyes flicked from the glowing hatch back to Dean. The shock melted away, instantly replaced by a predatory, mocking grin. He stepped closer. The smell of his cologne, something sharp, expensive, and heavy with sandalwood, cut through the stagnant, rotting smell of the barn. "My offshore trust was frozen this morning." Wyatt said, his tone casual, though a muscle ticked in his jaw. "The bank in the Caymans said the holding company restricted the funds, the holding company controlled by the old man. I went to his office, tore it apart. Nothing. Then I remembered he used to disappear to this rotting piece of firewood for weekends at a time." Wyatt shined the flashlight directly into Dean's eyes. Dean squinted, holding up a dirty hand to block the blinding glare. "Turn that off," Dean muttered, turning his head. "So," Wyatt continued, ignoring him, stepping right to the edge of the hole. He looked down into the brightly lit bunker. He let out a low whistle. The paranoid old bastard actually built a doomsday bunker. Amazing. Wyatt clicked the flashlight off and turned his gaze back to Dean. His eyes narrowed, taking in the mud on Dean's clothes, the blood on his hand, and the rigid, unnatural bulge beneath his cheap winter coat. "And what exactly?" Wyatt asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing its mocking edge. "Did you just pull out of there, cousin?" The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose, corrugated tin on the barn's sagging roof. It sounded like scraping fingernails. Dean took a step back, his bad knee throbbing. He pressed his arm tightly against his side, trying to minimize the rectangular outline of the ledger beneath his coat, but he knew it was futile. Wyatt wasn't an idiot. Entitled reckless and cruel, yes, but not stupid. "Nothing," Dean lied. The word hung in the damp air, pathetic and transparent. Wyatt laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "Nothing. You're bleeding. You're shaking like a stray dog, and you're holding your side like you've got a ruptured spleen. Give it here, Dean." "It's just some old books," Dean said, his throat tight. He took another step back, his boot heel hitting the rusted track of the heavy sliding door. There was nowhere else to go. "If it's just old books, you won't mind showing me," Wyatt said. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Before Dean could react, Wyatt reached out and grabbed the front of Dean's coat. The expensive camel hair fabric of Wyatt's sleeve brushed against Dean's cheek. Wyatt was taller, broader, fueled by a lifetime of expensive protein and personal trainers. Dean, fueled by cheap coffee and missed meals, felt his balance give way. "Get your hands off me!" Dean shouted, shoving his palms against Wyatt's chest. It wasn't a cinematic fight. It was an awkward, desperate scuffle. Wyatt yanked the coat hard. The cheap plastic zipper gave way with a loud tearing sound. Dean twisted, trying to turn his body, but Wyatt's other hand shot out, hitting Dean hard in the collarbone. Dean stumbled backward, his foot slipping in a patch of wet rot. As he fell, the ledger slipped from his grip. It tumbled out of his jacket and hit the dirt floor with a heavy, authoritative thud. It landed face up, the faded gold foil on the black leather, catching the faint light from the bunker hatch. Dean hit the ground hard, jarring his shoulder. He scrambled wildly for the book, his fingers scraping the dirt, but Wyatt was faster. Wyatt kicked Dean's hand away, not hard enough to break bones, but enough to sting, and bent down, scooping up the heavy ledger. "Let's see what the pauper found." Wyatt sneered, brushing a clump of damp earth off the cover. He flipped the book open casually, expecting perhaps a stash of bearer bonds or a hidden will. Dean stayed on the ground, his chest heaving. He watched Wyatt's face. He watched for the exact moment the world stopped spinning on its axis. It took about 6 seconds. Wyatt's eyes scanned the first page. His smug, relaxed posture stiffened. His brow furrowed in confusion. He flipped a page, then another. His thumb moved faster, turning chunks of pages at a time, the heavy paper tearing slightly under his frantic grip. The colour drained from Wyatt's face, starting from his cheeks and moving up to his forehead, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. The mocking light in his eyes extinguished, replaced by a hollow, expansive terror. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stopped flipping. His eyes were locked on a page near the middle of the book. Dean didn't need to see the page to know what it was. "Boulder," Dean said. His voice didn't crack this time. It was quiet, raspy from the dust, but it cut through the silence of the barn like a straight razor. Wyatt flinched, as if he had been struck. He didn't look away from the ledger. November 2005. Dean continued pushing himself up onto his knees. The damp cold of the dirt seeped through his trousers, but he barely felt it. $250,000 to the police chief, from the discretionary fund, to cover up a hit and run. The car was crushed at Miller Scrap. "Shut up," Wyatt whispered. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. His hands holding the edges of the book were trembling so violently the pages fluttered. "He kept the receipts, Wyatt," Dean said, slowly standing up. The pain in his knee was gone, replaced by a strange, numb buzzing. "The VIN numbers, the wire transfers. He kept it all in those filing cabinets down there. The keys are in my pocket. He underwrote your entire pathetic criminal life." Wyatt finally looked up. The arrogance was completely eradicated. He looked small. He looked like a panicked child wearing a dead man's expensive coat. For the first time in his entire life, Wyatt Whitmore was looking at Dean not as a nuisance, but as an executioner. "Dean!" Wyatt's voice shook. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Dean, we can work this out. Whatever you want. You want the offshore account, it's yours. I'll call the lawyers tomorrow. I'll sign it over." Dean looked at his cousin. He expected to feel a rush of triumph. He expected to feel like a titan standing victorious over the bully who had tormented him since childhood. He had fantasized about this moment having power over the family that discarded him for 20 years. But as he looked at Wyatt's terrified, pleading face, Dean didn't feel triumphant. He felt a deep, twisting nausea in the pit of his stomach. It was the same nausea he felt when he smelled the rotting wood of the barn. The money was poison. The legacy was poison. "Drop the book." "Wyatt," Dean said quietly. Wyatt hesitated, his eyes darting toward the open barn doors. For a split second, Dean saw the calculation in his cousin's eyes, the thought of running, of fighting, of destroying the book. "The cabinets are locked," Dean reminded him, his tone flat. "The keys are in my pocket. You destroy the index, I still have the evidence. Drop it." Wyatt's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him, draining away into the mud. He let go of the ledger. It hit the dirt between them. Dean stepped forward, picked up the book, and tucked it securely under his arm. He looked at Wyatt, then down into the glowing, sterile bunker below. He held the detonator to his family's empire. Now he just had to decide if he was willing to burn the house down with himself inside it. Rain began to drum heavily against the remaining sheets of corrugated tin on the barn's sagging roof. It started as a hesitant hollow tapping, but quickly escalated into a deafening rattle. Down in the bunker, the sound was muted, muffled by feet of earth, and poured concrete registering only as a low, continuous vibration. Dean stared at Wyatt. The silence between them in the brightly lit room felt thicker than the damp air upstairs. "Go down," Dean ordered, gesturing toward the open hatch with a slight nod. Wyatt blinked rainwater and sweat, beading at his perfectly styled hairline. The muscles in his neck strained against his cashmere collar. "What nom, Dean? Listen." "Go down, Wyatt." Dean repeated his voice, dropping into a harsh, grating register. "Or I walk out of here, drive to the nearest precinct, and hand this book to a detective." Wyatt's jaw clenched so hard Dean could hear his teeth grinding. He looked at the glowing square cut into the earth, then back at Dean. Slowly, reluctantly, he moved toward the edge. Watching his cousin, a man who had never done a day of manual labor in his life, whose hands were softer than most office workers, awkwardly navigate the rusted rebar ladder was a pathetic sight. Wyatt's camel hair coat snagged on a jagged piece of iron near the top rung. He cursed a sharp, breathless sound, tearing the expensive fabric before disappearing beneath the floorboards. Dean followed. He tucked the ledger tightly under his arm, pressing it against his ribs. He descended with practiced ease, his work-worn hands gripping the cold metal, securely ignoring the fresh sting of his reopened cut against the rusty rungs. When Dean's boots hit the concrete floor, Wyatt was standing in the center of the bunker. He was bathed in the sickly strobe-like greenish-white light of the fluorescent tubes. He looked around wildly, taking in the heavy steel desk, the meticulous workbench, and finally, the 3 massive fireproof filing cabinets lining the far wall. The arrogance that usually functioned as Wyatt's spine had completely evaporated. He looked like a trapped animal in a slaughterhouse. Dean walked past him. He pulled the heavy ring of keys from his pocket. They clinked loudly, a sharp metallic sound that made Wyatt flinch. Dean moved to the first cabinet on the left. He selected a thick brass key, slid it into the lock and turned. It gave way with a heavy, satisfying clack. He pulled the top drawer open. The metal glided smoothly on oiled ball bearings. It was packed tight. Hundreds of thick manila folders compressed together filled the drawer from front to back. Each one was meticulously labelled in Charles's harsh, slanted handwriting. 1998 to 2004. Dean set his voice flat and echoing off the cinder block walls. He didn't pull a folder out. He just let Wyatt stare at the sheer, overwhelming volume of it. Bribes, falsified building permits, tax evasion. He slammed the drawer shut. He moved to the second cabinet, inserted another key, and unlocked it. 2005 to 2012. "This is your era, Wyatt," Dean said, pulling the heavy drawer out. The hit and run in Boulder. The insider trading on the tech merger in 2008. The harassment settlements you thought Patricia's holding company buried. Wyatt squeezed his eyes shut. He raised a trembling hand and rubbed his temples, smearing a streak of wet mud across his forehead. "Stop. Please. Just... What do you want?" "I offered you the offshore trust. That's $8 million liquid. You never have to work a dock again. You can buy 10 farms, 100. Dean leaned back against the cold steel of the filing cabinet. He looked at his cousin. $8 million. 3 hours ago, he had prayed for a few thousand to fix his transmission and appease his landlord. Now generational wealth was being offered to him like a desperate, bloody plea bargain. But as he looked at Wyatt smelling the expensive sandalwood cologne mixing with the sharp, acidic scent of fear sweat, Dean felt an intense, overwhelming revulsion. Taking that money meant taking the poison. It meant stepping into Charles Whitmore's shoes, sitting at the head of a mahogany table built on rotting wood, holding a leash attached to the necks of criminals. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, managing their messes, becoming infected by their rot. "I don't want the offshore trust," Dean said quietly. Wyatt opened his eyes. Confusion warred with absolute panic on his pale face. "Then what? Patricia's Aspen estate, the holding company shares? Name it, Dean. Literally name your price. If I take the trust, I become a part of the machine," Dean said, tracing the edge of the metal drawer with his calloused thumb. "If I take the shares, I have to sit in boardrooms with you and Patricia. I'd have to look at you. I'd have to talk to you. Charles did that. He spent his whole life archiving your filth to keep you under his thumb. Look around Wyatt. He died in a windowless concrete hole, obsessed with controlling you." Dean pushed himself off the cabinet. He walked to the steel desk and picked up the letter his grandfather had left on top of the green glass lamp. "He wanted me to ruin you," Dean said, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. "Or he wanted me to blackmail you. He wanted me to become the new warden of this miserable family. So do it." Wyatt spat a sudden desperate anger flaring in his eyes, his voice cracking. "Take it all. Just don't burn me. Don't send me to a federal prison. I wouldn't last a week, Dean, and you know it." Dean looked down at the ledger tucked under his arm. It was heavy, so incredibly heavy. He realized then what true power was. It wasn't the ability to crush someone under your heel. It was the ability to walk away from the machine entirely, leaving them trapped in their own gears. The low, guttural hum of the generator behind the wall seemed to grow louder, filling the sterile air with a vibrating tension. Dean watched Wyatt unravel. The immaculate tailoring, the expensive haircut, the cultivated sneer, it had all melted away, leaving a terrified, hollow man standing in a puddle of muddy water on a concrete floor. "I'm not going to be your warden," Dean said, his voice steady, anchoring the chaotic energy in the room. "I'm not Charles, and I don't want $8 million of stolen, laundered money that the feds are probably already tracking." Wyatt stared at him, his chest heaving, his breath catching in his throat. "Then what you want me to beg is that you want me on my knees. There is a clean liquid contingency fund attached to the Miller Creek property," Dean said, ignoring the outburst. He recalled a minor detail from a legal document Henderson had droned through years ago during a previous family dispute. $2 million. It's legitimate. It's clean money. Charles set it up to maintain the agricultural acreage before he let it rot. Wyatt frowned, thrown completely off balance by the specific, relatively small demand. The whiplash was visible on his face. "The agricultural trust. Yeah, it's clean. It's just sitting there. You and Patricia are going to sign the release forms for that trust," Dean said. "You're going to transfer the entirety of it to a personal account in my name. By Tuesday at noon." Wyatt scoffed a nervous, involuntary sound that was half laugh, half sob. $2 million, Dean. You hold the keys to $1 billion empire, and you're asking for $2 million. "I'm asking for enough to disappear," Dean corrected him, his tone sharp, cutting off the protest. "Enough to fix my car, buy a piece of land that isn't poisoned by this family's name, and never see your face again." He walked back to the filing cabinets. He pulled the heavy ring of keys from his pocket. With a swift, deliberate motion, he tossed them onto the center of the steel desk. They landed with a sharp clatter, sliding across the metal surface before coming to a rest against the green glass lamp. Wyatt flinched, staring at the keys as if they were a live grenade. "The cabinets are yours," Dean said. Wyatt's head snapped up. His eyes widened. "What?" "I'm leaving the physical proof," Dean said, stepping back from the desk. "You can bring a heavy-duty shredder down here. You can buy a 50-gallon drum of gasoline, pour it down the hatch and burn it all. I don't care." Wyatt took a hesitant step toward the desk, his eyes locked on the keys. He reached out his fingers, hovering inches above the cold brass. "You're letting me destroy it. The paper in those cabinets, yes, Dean said. He tapped the heavy black leather cover of the ledger, still tucked securely under his arm. But I'm taking the index. Wyatt froze. The relief that had just begun to wash over his face drained away, instantly replaced by a cold, dreadful understanding. The ledger, Dean explained, pointing to the book. It has the dates, the amounts, the names of the people bribed, the account numbers. It's not the physical bank statements, but it's the roadmap. Any decent forensic accountant or federal prosecutor could use this to find the bodies. Dean, you can't, If I ever see you or Patricia again, Dean interrupted his voice, dropping to a near whisper that echoed loudly in the small room. If you ever try to contest the Miller Creek Trust, if you ever breathe a word about me to anyone, if you ever even drive through the town where I end up living, I will mail this book directly to the state attorney general. Wyatt swallowed hard. He looked at the keys on the desk, then at the ledger under Dean's arm. The realization settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He wasn't free. He was just paying for a different kind of silence. You have until Tuesday noon, Dean said, turning toward the ladder. Henderson will receive my call. If the funds aren't clear, the book gets mailed. Dean grabbed the cold rebar. The climb up felt infinitely easier than the descent. The air above, despite smelling of damp, rot-wet earth and rat droppings, felt cleaner, fresher. He pulled himself out of the hatch and stood in the dim light of the barn. The rain was lashing against the roof now, a deafening roar that washed away the oppressive silence of the property. He didn't wait for Wyatt to follow him up. He zipped his torn coat up to his chin. The ledger pressed hard against his ribs, a solid, immovable weight, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a shield. Dean walked out of the barn, his boots sinking deep into the freezing mud. The cold rain hit his face, immediately stinging his cheeks, washing the dust of the bunker from his skin. He waded through the weeds and reached his rusted sedan. The door screeched in protest as he pulled it open. He tossed the heavy ledger onto the passenger seat, right next to a pile of unpaid final notice utility bills. He slid behind the wheel and turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught roaring to life with an aggressive, shaking shudder. The heater kicked on, blasting cold, stale air into his face. Dean shifted the car into drive. He didn't look in the rearview mirror as he pulled away. He didn't look back at the rotting structure or at the glowing hatch in the floorboards. He just stared at the cracked asphalt ahead, listening to the rhythmic squeak of his windshield wipers finally breathing real air. Headlights sliced through the driving rain as Dean navigated the winding, treacherous dirt road leading away from Miller Creek. His knuckles were bone white on the cracked steering wheel, the violent shaking of the sedan forcing him to fight for control of every inch of the slick, muddy pavement. Beside him, resting incongruously on a pile of final notice utility bills, sat the heavy black ledger. It smelled like dry rot ozone and old paper, a distinct, acrid scent that quickly overpowered the stale odor of the car's interior. He didn't stop driving until the gas gauge needle dipped dangerously below the red line. Pulling into a neon-lit, desolate truck stop somewhere off the interstate, Dean threw the car into park. Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof of the gas station awning above him. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence inside the cab rang sharply in his ears. Dean sat there for 10 minutes, his breathing finally slowing down, his hands resting heavily on his thighs. They were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from a profound cellular exhaustion. His cut thumb throbbed in time with his heartbeat, the blood having dried into a stiff, dark crust against his skin. He grabbed the ledger, shoved it roughly into a cheap plastic grocery bag he found on the floorboard, and walked through the downpour into the diner attached to the station. Inside, the air was thick, smelling of burnt filter coffee, heavy frying oil, and wet wool. Dean slid into a cracked vinyl booth near the back corner. The cold material squeaked loudly beneath his damp clothes. A tired waitress with a smeared name tag poured him a mug of coffee, without asking, her eyes barely registering his presence. The ceramic mug was thick-chipped at the rim and radiated a glorious searing heat, directly into his freezing palms. He took a cautious sip. It was bitter, overly roasted, and absolutely perfect. Dean looked down at the plastic bag resting on the sticky Formica table. Inside was the power to obliterate his bloodline. He had walked away from $8 million of dirty, laundered money, demanding a clean $2 million instead. But as the adrenaline flushed entirely from his system, a cold, heavy wave of practical panic washed over him. He had $3.40 in his checking account. His rent was 3 weeks past due. He was relying on the sheer terror of a cowardly cousin to execute a multi-million-dollar wire transfer by Tuesday. If Wyatt called his bluff, if Patricia hired someone to find him and take the book by force, Dean had nothing but an old journal to defend himself. He ordered a plate of greasy hash browns and forced himself to eat. The food tasted like ash, his stomach too tight and twisted to process it properly, but he needed the calories to stop shaking. Dean spent the next 3 days barricaded in a cheap roadside motel, paying in cash from his meager emergency stash. The room smelled oppressively of industrial bleach and old cigarette smoke. He didn't sleep. He sat in the lopsided floral print armchair by the window, watching the highway traffic through the narrow gaps in the blackout curtains, the black leather ledger resting heavily on his lap like an anvil. Tuesday morning broke grey and bitterly cold. Dean sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, his phone resting face up on the cheap veneer nightstand. The cracked screen glowed with the time 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes. He hadn't showered. His clothes felt like a second dirty skin. He felt like a ghost suspended in a suffocating purgatory between the life of a broke labourer and whatever reality came next. 11:50 a.m. The industrial ice machine directly outside his door kicked on with a loud grinding roar that made Dean flinch. 11:58 a.m. 58. He picked up the phone. His thumb hovered over the estate lawyer's contact number. He imagined Wyatt and Patricia sitting in Henderson's sterile, mahogany-lined office, signing the agricultural trust, away their faces, pale, furious, and defeated. He imagined his grandfather Charles laughing from whatever hell he currently occupied. At exactly 12:01 p.m., the phone buzzed violently in Dean's palm. It wasn't Henderson calling. It was a silent push notification from his bank app. Dean swallowed hard. His mouth was completely dry, tasting of stale morning breath and anxiety. He tapped the notification. The app loaded agonizingly slowly, the spinning blue circle mocking his frayed nerves. Then the screen resolved into stark white and black text. Available balance $2,003.40. Dean dropped the phone onto the bed. It landed with a soft thud against the synthetic comforter. He didn't scream. He didn't punch the air or weep with joy. The reaction was far more visceral and intense physical deflation. He slumped forward, resting his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his rough, calloused hands. A single ragged breath shuddered out of his lungs, carrying 30 years of scraping, striving, and deep humiliation out with it. It was done. They had paid the ransom for their own miserable legacy. Dean stood up. His legs felt strangely light, almost disconnected from the rest of his body. He picked up the black ledger. Walking into the cramped, mildewed bathroom, he grabbed a thin motel towel and wrapped the book tightly in the scratchy white cotton. He placed it carefully into the bottom of his canvas duffel bag, zipping it shut. It wasn't evidence anymore. It was an insurance policy. A loaded gun he would bury so deep, no one would ever find it unless they forced him to dig it up. An hour later, Dean walked out of the motel room into the crisp, freezing air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sky a bruised, vibrant purple. He tossed his bag onto the passenger seat of his car. Opening his phone, he dialed his landlord's number, leaving a brief, emotionless voicemail stating he was breaking his lease and surrendering the security deposit. Next, he searched the map for the nearest town with a reputable auto mechanic. He needed a new transmission, or maybe just a used, reliable truck. Something sturdy. Something built for the dirt roads. As he put the car in drive, the engine protested, sputtering its familiar pathetic rhythm before catching. Dean just smiled. It was a small, cracked smile, imperfect and deeply tired. He turned the wheel, steering the car away from the city, away from the Whitmore Empire, and drove out toward the open, unpaved roads of the high country. He had mud on his boots and millions in the bank. He was finally a pauper on his own terms. Power isn't always about crushing your enemies. Sometimes it's simply having the leverage to walk away from their poison. Dean chose a quiet life over a corrupt empire trading a rotting legacy for clean freedom. What would you have done with the ledger? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded emotional dramas.